Imagine spending $160 on a new piece of hardware for your Sega Mega Drive. 6 months later, Sega announces an entirely new console. Your purchase is already obsolete. This wasn't a hypothetical nightmare. This is exactly what happened to thousands of Sega fans in 1994. And it's the story of how one company made a series of decisions so catastrophic they cost themselves an entire industry. Before we get into the disasters, it's worth understanding just how powerful Sega actually were at their peak. The early 1990s was the era of the console wars in their purest form. On one side, Nintendo, the established giant with Mario, Zelda, and a stranglehold on family gaming. On the other, Sega, the scrappy challenger who dared to market themselves as the cooler, edgier alternative. And for a while, it was working. By 1992, Sega had captured roughly 65% of the US console market with the Mega Drive, known as the Genesis in North America. Sonic the Hedgehog had become a genuine cultural phenomenon. The blast processing marketing campaign was everywhere. Sega were winning, or at least winning enough to be dangerous.
So what's blast processing do? And what if you don't have blast processing?
In 1991, Sega released the Sega CD, an add-on for the Mega Drive that promised to bring CD-ROM gaming into your living room. Full motion video, enhanced soundtracks, larger game storage. On paper it sounded like the future. It launched at $299 in North America, which meant a consumer who already owned a Mega Drive was looking at a combined hardware cost of nearly $500 to access any of it. The game library was underwhelming. The FMV titles, games like Night Trap and Sewer Shark, were technically impressive for the time, but had the gameplay depth of a cereal box. The Sega CD sold around 6 million units over its lifetime. Not a disaster in isolation, but a long way short of what Sega needed it to be. What it actually was, though, was a warning sign. One that Sega either didn't recognize or chose to ignore. The message was straightforward. Consumers don't want expensive hardware add-ons with limited software support. They want a compelling reason to upgrade. Sega's response to that lesson? Make another add-on. This is where the story gets genuinely difficult to understand. By 1994, Sega knew the Mega Drive was aging. The SNES had closed the performance gap, and more importantly, the next generation of consoles was already in development. Sony were deep in production on what would become the PlayStation. Sega themselves were finalizing what would become the Sega Saturn. So what did Sega release in November 1994? The Sega 32X. A mushroom-shaped cartridge that plugged directly into the top of the Mega Drive, promising to bridge the gap between 16-bit gaming and the next generation. It launched at $159.99 in North America. Here's where the logic completely falls apart. Sega knew the Saturn was already scheduled for a Japanese launch in November 1994, the exact same month as the 32X. They were releasing two competing hardware products simultaneously. The internal justification was that the 32X would give Sega's enormous existing Mega Drive install base a way to experience enhanced gaming, while they waited for the Saturn, generating revenue and keeping consumers inside the Sega ecosystem in the meantime. What it actually did was confuse everyone. Retailers didn't know how to position it. Is this a new console? An add-on? If the Saturn is already coming, why would I spend $160 on this? Consumers were asking the same questions. And with a game library that peaked at just 40 titles, many of which were ports of existing games, there simply wasn't enough software support to justify the purchase. Sega sold approximately 800,000 units in North America against an internal target of 1.5 million for Christmas 1994 alone. Within a year, the 32X was being sold in bargain bins for under $20. The engineering time, the manufacturing, the marketing spend, enormous amounts of resource, all funneled into a product that lasted less than 18 months on the market. But even that wasn't the real damage. The real damage was what it did to trust. Because by the end of 1994, Sega had asked their most loyal customers to buy a Mega Drive, then a Sega CD add-on, and then a 32X add-on on top of that. 3 separate hardware purchases layered on top of each other, and now they were about to ask those same customers to buy an entirely new console. How many times can you go back to the same well before people stop coming? E3, May 1995. Sony take the stage and announce the PlayStation's North American launch price, $299, confident, deliberate, a direct challenge to everyone in the industry.
$299.
Earlier that same afternoon, Sega of America President Tom Kalinske had walked onto the same stage and made an announcement nobody in the room was expecting. The Sega Saturn was available. Right now. Today. In selected retailers across the United States. The reaction in the room suggested it looked like a masterstroke, getting to market before Sony, stealing the headlines, catching the competition off guard. But here's what was actually happening behind the scenes. Retailers who hadn't been informed about the surprise launch, including major Sega partners like KB Toys, Walmart, and Toys R Us, were furious. They hadn't received stock, hadn't been briefed, and hadn't been given the opportunity to prepare. Some dropped Sega products entirely. Others cut back floor space and promotional support at exactly the moment Sega needed maximum retail presence. Third-party developers who had been building towards a holiday launch were equally blindsided. Games weren't ready. Developer support began to dry up. And then Sony stepped to the microphone and announced the PlayStation at $299. The Saturn had launched at $399. $100 more expensive for hardware that was widely considered less capable of running the 3D games that were about to define the generation. In a single afternoon, Sega had managed to alienate their retail partners, catch their developers off guard, and lose on both price and hardware specifications. Sega's final attempt was the Dreamcast, and it genuinely deserves credit. Launched in 1998 in Japan and 1999 globally, the Dreamcast was ahead of its time. Built-in online connectivity, a strong launch lineup, and a launch price of $199 in North America. It sold 500,000 units in its first 2 weeks in the US alone. For a moment it looked like Sega might have found a way through, but the damage from the 32X and Saturn era had permanently altered the landscape. Third-party developers, burned by the Saturn's underperformance and Sega's track record of unpredictable hardware decisions, were hesitant to fully commit. When Sony announced the PlayStation 2 with DVD playback and an enormous brand following, the writing was already on the wall. EA, at that point one of the most influential publishers in the industry, refused to develop for the Dreamcast entirely, citing unresolved disputes from the Saturn era. That single decision cost Sega access to some of the most commercially dominant sports franchises in gaming, at a time when sports titles were selling millions of units a year. On March 31st, 2001, Sega officially discontinued the Dreamcast. Approximately 10.6 million units had been sold. Impressive in isolation, nowhere near enough to sustain a hardware business against the PlayStation 2 and the incoming Xbox. That was Sega's last console, and it has remained their last console ever since. Today Sega is one of gaming's most successful publishers. Sonic, the Yakuza series, Total War, Football Manager. The catalogue speaks for itself, and in some ways free from the cost and risk of hardware manufacturing. They've arguably thrived more consistently than they ever did as a console maker. But the question that lingers is a straightforward one. Did it have to end this way? The Sega CD, the 32X, the E3 Saturn surprise? Each of these decisions made sense to somebody in a boardroom somewhere. Taken together, they represent one of the most well-documented cases of corporate self-destruction in entertainment history. Sega didn't lose to Nintendo and Sony because they ran out of talent, or ideas, or even money. They lost because they ran out of trust, retail trust, developer trust, and most importantly, the trust of the consumers who had supported them from the beginning. And once that's gone, there's no add-on for it. If you want more context on the era that shaped all of this, the video game crash of 1983 is already up on the channel. A lot of the patterns that caused that crash directly influenced the decisions Sega made a decade later, so it's worth a watch. If this is the kind of gaming history content you want to see more of, drop a like, subscribe to the channel, and make sure to ring the bell to make sure you're notified when fresh content goes live. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.